Assalamu alaikum dear students. Welcome back for the new lesson. Today our lesson is chapter number 14, section number 2, a new kind of war. You can find this lesson in your textbook page number 460. Let's begin with the lesson. The lesson's objectives of the lessons are that at the end of the lesson you must be able to understand why a stalemate developed on the western front of the war. Describe how the technology made the World War I different from the previous wars, and outline the course of the war on the Eastern Front and in other parts of the Europe, in Turkey, and in the Middle East. And you must be able to summarize how the colonies fought in the war. Important terms in the lesson are stalemate. Stalemate is a kind of a deadlock when the two enemy sides are fighting a battle and both of them are unable to defeat each other, so they are stuck in one position. Zeppelins, they are large gas-filled balloons. They were used to bomb the enemy territory, or you can say to spy them from the air. Although their range and their load capacity was very limited, but still they made a huge impact because at that time they were in their early time of development. The most important weapon of the war that made a huge mark was the German submarines. They were known as U-boats. They were destructive because because the enemies were unable to detect them. Reason that they were under the surface of the water. Convoy, it's a group of merchant ships that is protected by warships. Dardanelles is a very important location that connects Mediterranean Sea to the Black Sea, and Turkey was controlling that important geographical location because it was one of the most important supply lines for Russia. T.E. Lawrence, one of the British spy that played a great role in destabilizing the Ottoman control in the Middle East through using sabotage and terrorism. Our first question today is that how and where was World War I fought? First of all, you need to know that World War I was not between two countries only. It was a war which involved so many countries at the same time. Primarily, it was fought in Europe, but eventually it spread to other parts of the world where the European colonies in Asia and Africa and Middle East, they also had to participate in the war. Then the second portion of the question that how this war was fought. The picture of the war was very much different from the past. This war was completely a different scenario because it involved new weapons which were very much sophisticated. They were advanced, they were more deadly and destructive. And these weapons include like tanks, airplanes, and submarines. And the most important thing in this war was the new war techniques that were employed by the warring nations. One of the most important war technique was the use of trenches. Basically, a trench is kind of a hole dug into the earth where the soldiers are taking their position and they are not exposed to enemy fire, whereas they can use their machine guns to attack an advancing army without bringing any loss to their own. So by this way, the enemy formations could be attacked easily and the enemy was unable to cross the trenches. That's why both sides, both warring nations at any battlefront, they were locked and they were unable to defeat each other. As we discussed in the previous lesson that Central Powers, geographically they were in the middle of the battlefront with allies on the sides. So Central Powers were facing a dual front war with Russia in the east and France and Britain in the west. So in order to cope up this kind of situation, Germany had to utilize a specific plan which was particularly designed to face or to cope up with this kind of situation. The plan was known as Schlieffen Plan, and according to this plan, Germany was supposed to attack or to defeat France before turning to Russia. But to attack France, Germany needed to first attack Belgium and drop their soldiers behind the French supply lines. When they did this, actually, they miscalculated the resistance power of Belgians. They believed that Belgium is a small nation, so they will easily be able to defeat Belgians, but they were wrong. Belgians resisted much more than what the Germans believed. They wasted some important time for the Germans to defeat French. In the meantime, Russians they were able to mobilize more quickly on the Eastern Front. As a result, Germany, in a hesitation, responded by shifting some of the troops from the French battlefront to the Russian battlefront. As a result, Germany was in the middle of a crisis. They were not able to defeat the French, and in the same time, Russians they reached the battlefronts much earlier than they were expected. So the plan actually failed for Germans, and a quick German victory was now impossible. Both sides they dug the vast system of deep trenches, as I just explained before, that these trenches were a best protection from the enemy fire, and these trenches created a deadly stalemate on the western front particularly. The area between the opposing trenches, one side enemy and the other side enemy, the area in between the two enemies became a no man's land, because any party tried to come on this area was to be under enemy fire. So that area became no man's land. They both sides could not get into that area. Each side they launched attacks and counter-attacks, but they had very little success because of the trench warfare. They were unable to gain any territory. As a result, battle lines in the western front of the war they remained almost the same for throughout the war years. This is the picture of the trench warfare. You can see that the soldiers they are naturally protected by the earth. They are not exposed, their bodies are not exposed to the enemy ground fire. The only way to attack this soldier more effectively is either to bomb them from the air or to use artillery shells that will be attacking them on a raised angle, by this way destroying the trench. Otherwise, machine gun fire is unable to damage the men standing in a trench. So by this way they can stop the entire enemy formation from advancement. So millions of soldiers they remained in the trenches for a long period of the war, particularly on the western front. That's why there was a deadlock. The newly developed weapons they made a huge mark because they were sophisticated, they were advanced, so they made a great contribution in defining the outcome of the war. In some battles, for example, thousands of people were killed because of this modern warfare. The most defining weapon was the rapid fire machine gun that could kill thousands of soldiers in minutes. Long range artillery guns were one of the best way to stay at distance from the enemy fire and killing them with large destructive shells. One of the most destructive weapon was poison gas. Basically, that was a kind of weapon that actually reduced the enemy fighting ability by blinding or choking their soldiers and creating illness, long-term illness, so that their war ability became reduced. Some other technology, for example, tanks, they were able to move through the trenches because they were armored vehicles. They were protected from the enemy machine gun fire. The soldiers could cross through the trenches, but their arrival was very late. Still, they could not make a huge difference because they were in very early form of technological advancements. Zeppelins, they were used to bomb the English coast, but as I told you, their range was limited, so they could not make a big difference by defeating Britain. Airplanes were also in their early stage of development, and much of their use were restricted to the aerial dogfights, and they were very rarely used for bombing long distance enemy targets on the ground. The most important weapon that made a huge difference between the opposing side was submarines. Germany was possessing this weapon, and Germany was able to destroy a huge number of enemy naval warships as well as the merchant ships. To deal with this deadly weapon, the Allies, they used the technique of convoys, where the merchant ships were protected by the military ships. As a result, they were able to maintain important supply lines. On the eastern front of the war, there were also high casualties in terms of soldiers. The reason is that Russia, despite being a big country, was lacking important infrastructure. They were lacking in terms of equipment, technology, weapons, and training of the soldiers. Russia, because it was not as industrialized as the other European nations, that's why it had to bear these kinds of losses. Soldiers were very poorly equipped, but they were sent to the battlegrounds even sometimes without proper weapons and without proper training. So, on the Eastern Front, although Germany could not get any territorial gains, but still Germany inflicted heavy casualties against the Soviets, against the Russians. Sorry. As the war spread out in different parts of the Europe, other nations, particularly in Balkans, they joined the war in 1915. Um, Bulgaria joined the war by siding Central Powers, Germany and Austria-Hungary, because Bulgarians, they wanted to balance their old accounts against Serbia, the Slavic state. At the same time, Romania, they joined allies in order to take revenge against Hungary. And Italy, that was part of the Triple Alliance before the war, joined on the sides of allies because Britain secretly promised them the Austrian lands in favor of joining on the sides of allies. So Italian troops joined on the sides of Britain in 1915, but because they were not as much developed, as much equipped, so British and French troops, they had to provide them all kinds of support in their battlegrounds. The most important strategic player in the war was Ottoman Empire, and unfortunately they sided with the Central Powers. Its geography actually was one of the most important factor for Ottoman Empire to define whether to join with the Allies or to join with the Germany. The secret story is that Germany actually threatened Ottoman Empire that if it joins from the other side, it will face the German expansion against the Ottoman Empire. So Ottoman Empire, out of fear, they sided with Central Powers in late 1914. So they played an important role in cutting off the Russian supply lines by Britain and France, that they were providing important war equipment. The Bosphorus was one of the most important geographical location, which was the only supply lines, and Ottoman Empire was controlling the Dardanelles. This slide tells you the story of the Dardanelles, that in one big battle, the Allies, they suffered 200,000 casualties in order to keep the supply lines open. But then following this defeat, actually they left the idea of trying to get an access through Dardanelles. So this was one of the most disastrous defeat for the Allies, and for a long period after this time, until the end of the war, Allies did not try to get through the Dardanelles to provide important war supplies to Russia. This slide tells you the story of the war in the Middle East. You can see from the map that Ottoman Empire was controlling a very important geographical location, and at the same time Ottoman Empire was a multi-ethnic empire. There were different ethnic groups in the empire that were demanding the separation and freedom at that time. So Britain and France utilized this situation for their favor. One of the British spy, Colonel T.E. Lawrence, was sent for a sabotage and terrorism mission. What did they do? That they destroyed important infrastructures by bombing and sabotage in order to reduce the war strength of Ottoman Empire. At the same time, Armenians inside Ottoman Empire, they were helping Russians. As a result, Ottoman Empire had to come back brutally against them. Those who were helping Russians, they had to face severe punishment. European colonies around the world, they participated or they contributed in the war. For example, German colonies in Africa, they were attacked by allies. So these countries, whether willing or not willing, they had to fight the war. Similarly, British colonies of India and French colony in the West Africa, they sent the troops in Europe to fight alongside the British and French soldiers. And same is the case with Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. They were the British colonies. They sent their soldiers to support the Britain in their war in Europe. So the reason for the colonies joining the war was that they believed that joining with the European powers in the war will help them to get their trust and ultimately get their independence. So that was the hope which ultimately at the end of the war was waned out. The reason is that instead of getting the independence, these colonial powers further strengthened their grip on the colonies because they needed raw materials for the sake of improving their economic position after the war. So that is the end of the lesson. I hope this will help you to understand the concept that how this war was different and how it was fought around the world, what countries they joined the war. We will come back with a new lesson next week, inshallah. Hope to see you soon. Thank you very much.